debt over the various
Yeah.
asset classes. Do we know who owns this debt? Because somebody's debt is somebody else's asset. So who owns this debt then?
No, I mean, I don't have that information, but yeah, basically this is showing the changes in the composition of the debt. So that's the main point of this graph.
But if this debt is owned by pension funds, where ordinary people will get income from in 20 years' time, then it's not the end of the world.
No. I mean, I'm not saying that debt itself is a bad thing. I mean, if you use it well, you are actually better off with that. So I'm not one of those people who say that any debt is bad. I mean, there's basically the 17th century idea of financial management. In the long run, it makes sense to borrow, whether you're a government or a company or an individual, to borrow to invest. Also, you might have to borrow according to your life cycle. When you're young, you have a few accumulated assets, so you might want to borrow money to buy a house or pay for your university degree or whatever, and then you pay it down later. So no, this chart is not about condemning debt, but debt that in the long run might be okay, but in the short run it creates all sorts of can create all sorts of problems with repayment and so on. So the fact that the household is now much more dependent on debt makes their financial positions more kind of open to instability. So that's the only point I was trying to make with it.
So a broad question is what your position is on the financial sector's role in shaping the economy. So choosing who is creditworthy, what type of operation should be given credit, given loans, so on, and what. So kind of going back to the role of the state, what can the state impose on the financial sector in terms of guiding it towards giving credit to greener operations? Or
basically, you have to start from the point that there are many different financial needs, and we cannot have a kind of uniform regulation. So I'm not talking about some Soviet-style monobank, which does only one thing. I mean, we have different financial needs of different individuals and corporations and countries. So, arguing for better regulation isn't necessarily kind of calling for some kind of uniform idea of how it should be done. But we have discussed the problematic features of the current system. So, for example, if you want to increase the long-term investment, you might have to not only change banking regulation to encourage corporate lending. You could do various things to do that, tax incentives or whatever. But also that you have to change the corporate governance system. One possibility is to give differential voting shares to different shares, so that some core group can attract more capital without hugely diluting their control. So, in my lecture on production and the firm, I talked about the Swedish example where essentially one family controls half the Swedish corporate sector because Sweden had this system of differential voting shares, some shares having up to 1,000 times more voting rights than others. Actually, in the US, companies like Facebook and Google, they have maintained control by the core groups through these means. I mean, they issued a lot of non-voting shares. And Mark Zuckerberg, even though in terms of sheer number of shares that he owns in Facebook, it is only about 28% that controls more than 50% of the voting shares. So that's one possibility, but also you could introduce what is known as tenure voting. So the longer you hold the share, the more votes you get. Actually, Italy and France recently introduced a very minimal form of this. They basically decided that if you hold the shares for more than 2 years, you get an extra vote or something like that. But I would say, why stop there? Yeah? Why not say you hold the share less than 1 year, you get only 1 vote. If you hold it for 3 years, you get 5 votes. If you hold it for 10 years, you get 20 votes. Yeah? Why not? Yeah? If you did something like that, there'll be greater incentive to hold the shares for longer. You could give a tax advantage for kind of capital gains made out of that share trading, which favors long-term shareholders. Yeah? So even if you make the same capital gain from selling your shares, if you have held it longer, the tax rate is lower. You can do a lot of things to basically encourage long-term investment, but you first have to accept that this is happening. Yeah? A lot of people don't know that this is happening. A lot of people think stock market actually gives money to the corporate sector. No, in a lot of countries, they take money out of the corporate sector. Yeah? So once you recognize the problem, then there are many possible solutions. Yeah? You can do it with banking regulation. You can do it with that reform of the corporate sector. You can do it with the tax incentives for and against certain things. Yeah? There are lots of tools. Yeah? It's only because people don't want to do it that they don't do it. Yeah?
Just going back to debt for a moment. So there's a few people that said, for example, they predicted the financial crisis. Thinking of people like Anne Pettifor, focusing particularly on Steve Keen, for example, who would take Minsky's hypothesis and pretty much puts the blame on debt to GDP ratio. So if you look, he's got, I think, one book, How to Stop Another Financial Crisis. He essentially will model debt to GDP ratio and say there's a particular sweet spot whereby you can say an economy is in sort of pre-meltdown mode or pre-crisis mode. Have you got any comments on the validity of that work or the insight there at all?
Oh, well, I'm not sure whether we can predict financial crisis purely based on debt to GDP ratio. I mean, it's one of the factors, but as I discussed here, I mean, it's got to do with extreme complexity, increased short-termism, as well as some features of the political economy. Because, in the United States, basically, the financial sector, more like one financial institution, that is Goldman Sachs, has taken over the government. More than half of the U.S. Treasury Secretary in the last 3-4 decades, they are from the financial sector. And quite a few of them are actually from one bank, Goldman Sachs, Robert Rubin, Hank Paulson. So, when you have a political economy like that, I mean, there's a fat chance that they'll put regulations that constrain the activities of these institutions. So you need to look at a lot of different things. I mean, countries like Denmark, which has a quite high debt to GDP ratio, but doesn't seem to have suffered so much from it. So I think that we need to look in greater detail the financial structure of each country, the political economy of it, and the regulatory regime. I don't think that it is possible to predict these things with just one indicator. I mean, it might be the best indicator, I don't know. But quantitative indicators can tell you only so much. So yes, I mean, if you need one simple number, maybe that's what you need to use, maybe 2 simple numbers, but you need to know the institutional details, political economy, and so on.
So a bit of a backstory to this. This is a comment that you might have a comment of reaction to. 2 years ago, I was lucky enough to have an internship in the European Union when they were legislating. There was a lot of legislation going on still as a reaction to the financial crisis. So I got to sit in on these negotiations of the STS, so securitizations, and trying to make them regulated or capital requirements or these things. And there seems to be a peculiar thing that happens every time there's a political or even a theoretical discussions about financial systems, as opposed to other parts of economic discussions or politics or anything, which is that people kind of disappear. That like the people defaulting on loans in the US or subprime, they completely disappear from the discussion. When sitting in these negotiations, it was astonishing to me that no one was mentioning, for instance, that it was primarily black single mothers in the US that lost a home and all these kind of consequences are never really either in the discussions and what we do from here, and neither are they in our understanding of what the financial system is. That kind of micro level just is forgotten.
Somehow we have come to get our priority wrong. Finance or the economy, they are means to an end. The end should be human welfare, that a more equitable society, society that takes care of the weak, and finance or production or all these things should be considered as a means. Somehow these have become the ends. So what matters is that how much profit the financial sector is generating. I mean, how fast your GDP growth is. Well, I'm not saying that these things are meaningless, and they can be very important because that you have to have a sustainable economy in order to take care of your citizens well. But somehow we have inverted the means and the ends. So people have disappeared, as you say, and also you have to accept that a lot of people who discuss these things come from a background where they probably have never met a person who's ever been unemployed in their lives. They've never met a poor person. They've never lived in deprived areas. So for them, I mean, these are just like unicorns, something that exists in stories. But unfortunately, the narrow social and class backgrounds of top policymakers, which has been getting narrower and narrower, I think that makes these people very insensitive to lives of ordinary people. And on top of that, the lobbying. When the Americans, I mean, Donald Trump has reversed a lot of this, but when the Americans were discussing the so-called Frank-Dodd Act to strengthen regulation on the financial sector soon after the financial crisis, it was said that there were 6 lobbyists per each congressman in Washington, D.C., sent from the financial sector. And when you hear stories from only one group of people, I'm sure some of these congressmen knew that their constituency that people who might have got into trouble with this and so on. But when the predominant story that you hear from the banks is that no, we can manage with that capital reserve ratio of only 4%. That don't raise it to 8%. That this will be ruin of our economy. When they meet those people primarily and very rarely talk to people who have lost their houses because of mis-selling of mortgage loans, and the people who have lost their jobs because of the financial crisis, their perspective is necessarily going to be distorted. So yes, unfortunately, that is a struggle. But this is why I believe that mass economic literacy is so important, because ordinary citizens need to know what's going on. They need to understand the basic principles of economics and what is wrong with the kind of version that they are getting from mainstream economics and the policymakers. only then they can speak for themselves. Yeah? Unfortunately, economists have been fantastically good at making people believe that what they do is very difficult. Yeah? No, seriously, I mean, that people have very strong opinions on all sorts of things. Yeah? On the European Union, the Iraq War, climate change, without having any qualification to comment on this. Yeah? I have my views on the Iraq War, but do I have a degree in international relations? I mean, I took one international relations class back in 1983 as a university student, and the old professor who taught me was using a textbook from the 1960s. Yeah? So what little I know about international relations is more than 50 years old. Yeah? But I still make comments. Yeah? I still have strong views. Yeah? But when it comes to economics, a lot of people say, oh, that's for the experts. Yeah? Oh, too complicated for me. Yeah? No. I mean, if they are willing to have an opinion on climate change and Brexit and the EU and the development programs that are in Africa, why should they not have an opinion on the financial sector, the macroeconomy, management of government budget? Yeah? It's only because that people have been scared into believing that this is too difficult. You just listen to us. Yeah? And I mean, the Brexit example is a perfect example of that kind of approach backfiring. Yeah? Because now people say, well, we don't know what you are saying, but we think you're wrong. Yeah? That's very unfortunate. Yeah? I mean, if we had paid more attention to making people understand about the economy and have more informed opinion about it, they might have a rather different approach to the whole thing. Yeah?
Leading off of actually what you just said, I appreciated your comments about sort of the acceptance of the general public, at least in the US, but elsewhere as well, of their financial situation, in part due to the fact that there have been perceived opportunities, to take debt. And I think if you, really analyze this in addition, looking at education system in the US over the years and lack of investment in that how it's really become quite convenient, the complexity of the financial system, not just for economists, but for those that benefit from the financial system as it is. I mean, how that complexity has become sort of almost a form of concept control, or as Putnam says, that it's so overwhelming for the average American to wrap their head around the financial system itself, that they just take what they're offered in the mail, as this credit card that you can have. And just how coercive that really is in a fundamental way.
That's right. Yeah.
The convenience of that complexity.
Yeah. No, you're very right. But I don't think it's just the ordinary citizens who are economically illiterate. I mean, some years ago read this newspaper article in New York Times saying that something like 40% of an Ivy League school, one of the top universities, I forget which one it was, that they didn't understand the concept of compound interest rate. Yeah? So it's not just that poor people who have that problem, but yes, I mean basically this increase in complexity, you're right, has been used as a way to kind of keep people away from criticizing the current system, because I'm a trained economist, and it took me quite a while to understand all these financial product, ABS, CDO, So the chance of people who haven't had economics education have to juggle 3 jobs to make ends meet, having time to sit down and read about these things and make sense of it is rather low, unless, people like you, people like me, we write about it, we talk to people about it, we encourage them to read certain things which are accessible. But I think the education of the general public what I call mass economic literacy is extremely important because, first of all, we are material beings and we cannot make our society better without changing the economy. Today, especially, economics has become the language of power. I sometimes liken it to Catholic theology in medieval Europe. Basically, it has become an ideology that justifies the status quo. Whatever exists because it's efficient, because it's beaten the competition. And unless that you are able to understand what these people are saying, in the old days, the Vatican banned the translation of the Bible from Latin into local vernacular languages. So only educated the priest and some elites that could read it. So it's a bit like that. Today, they say, I'm an expert, I ran my model, shows that you are 4,300 worse off if there's Brexit. But the people need to have some knowledge to see through these things and engage with these people. Unfortunately, a lot of people just have given up. So I think it's very important that especially your generation go out and talk to people, spread the knowledge. Students' movement like rethinking economics and the economy. They have been developing this mass economics education program. So yes, I very much encourage you to, even if you're not involved in those systematic programs, talk to people around you, younger people, and try to alert them to the need that we all need to pick up some economics, because otherwise we are not going to change anything.
So you were saying that lots of people, because with wages aren't growing, people are basically borrowing to maintain like a consistent standard of living. Yeah. I'm just thinking, if you're restricting access of them to borrowing through this sort of regulation, increased regulation, is that improving their lives if they are then going to suffer in real terms and they're not going to be able to grow to the degree that they could through taking on debt? And I don't really see governments sort of stepping up to fill the gap through taxation. So, is it for the best, really, for those that are the most vulnerable?
No, but you have to find other ways, including the government increasing taxation and increasing welfare spending. No, because if you accept what those in power tell you that this is how it should be, you will never make the society better. So you have to demand that instead of having to rely on this the high interest rate loans, these people should have more social welfare spending. They need to be given more the security in their lives. That's the whole idea of the welfare state, isn't it? Is that in the end, some people mistake it as a handout from people with money to people with no money. That may not be entirely wrong in countries like the US, but at least in Europe, it's a collective social insurance system. So by kind of cutting that, you are exposing these vulnerable people more and more to the vagaries of the market. And in order to deal with that, they need to borrow more, and then that exposes them to financial risk. So you need to demand more security in life. That's why Americans call it social security, isn't it? And if that requires collecting more taxes, yes, so be it. I think you could simply start by collecting more taxes from these global companies by abolishing tax havens.
I agree, and I would love that to happen, absolutely. But I guess I just don't see it happening as quickly as the regulation would maybe happen. And so I feel like there will be a shortfall
exactly.
where those will suffer. Who
Yeah, no, you need to
deserve it the least.
Yeah, I mean, have this the changes in a kind of planned, coordinated way. Huh? Even if your ultimate goal is to get rid of the need for most of these extra borrowings. Until you get there, you might have to have interim stages. Yeah, because if you are in an economy with household debt having risen from 20% of GDP to 100% of GDP, I'm not necessarily saying that 20% is ideal, but even to bring it down to 30 or 40%, you cannot do it overnight. Yeah? It will take time, and in the meantime, as you said, you have to find means to enable these people to cope with reduced the availability of loans. And yes, it will take time to put these tax reforms in motion. Well, my view is that your ultimate goals should be radical, but the method with which you get there should be gradual, because radical changes can produce more cost than problems. Yeah? Well, radical in terms of the speed at which it's done, but paradoxically, when you do it gradually, the ultimate goal can be achieved in a more secure and sustainable way. So let's aim for the moon, yeah, so to speak. But then, let's not think that we can just jump to the moon without anything. Yeah, you need time to build the rocket. Yeah.
How do you sit that in like our 5-year electoral system? Because I think it's very easy for governments to appeal to those like in the middle who will be like, oh, look at all these people who are sort of taking your money, which obviously I don't think is true.
Yeah.
But it's very easy. I guess that's sort of what the Brexit debate was about to some extent. It was like, now it's immigrants who are taking your money.
Right, yeah.
And so it shows how easy it is to sell that to the electorate. So if you're doing it on like a gradual term, how do you stop that from being like cut short because you're thrown out of government?
Yeah, no, but you first have to change that discourse. Yeah, I mean, this idea that poor people are just taking. No, poor people also pay taxes. They pay that VAT. Yeah, they pay fuel tax. Yeah, they pay lots of other taxes. So this idea that somehow poor people, simply because they don't pay much income tax, they don't pay tax is wrong. At the other end, that there are all these global companies by using tax havens who are not paying the taxes that really owe to the society. Yeah, so you need to change the whole discourse about tax. I mean, for example, economists use this term tax burden. Yeah? Why is it a burden? Yeah? It's the price that you pay for public service. Yeah? Do you call your Netflix subscription a burden? Yeah, let's call it Netflix burden because it's taking money away from you, but that's not how people see it. Yeah? So you have to change this way that people understand about taxation, government spending, social insurance, security. And once you have done that, your argument will become less vulnerable to this kind of demagoguery that British tabloid press is so good at. And yeah, but I recognize that with these electoral cycles, it's more difficult. But that's what we have to manage with, because otherwise, are we going to argue for some kind of dictatorship? I lived the first 25 years of my life under military dictatorship, and I don't recommend it to anyone. So yeah, I mean, even if it means that these electoral cycles make reforms that are more difficult to make, well, that's the price you have to pay to have democracy.
Do you think it's politicians that should be leading that changing of the sort of discourse? Or do you think it's like economists, like us as sort of like a subsection of society? Like who should be the one who's taking on that burden?
Well, everyone should play their role. You need more academically oriented people who create these arguments, provide evidence, because politicians don't have time to do it. From my experience as a policy economist, in general, people in government or politics, the junior most guy may be able to read some 25-page document, but as you go higher up, the time they have to digest information is shrinking rapidly. So you need, I don't know, the 2 paragraphs for the minister. Presidents might have time for 2 sentences. So these people don't have time to generate information. That's our job. But then we are not experts in persuading people, building coalitions. That's the politician's job. I mean, if they don't do that, why are they there? So we all have to play a role. I mean, the ordinary citizens also have to engage in this, because I mean, it's no good if a small group of dissident economists make noises and no one listens to them. So they need to get engaged. And government officials need to come up with policy plans, because the kind of proposals that people like us make, they're going to be rather idealistic and devoid of understanding of the political context. So it's the job of the government officials to turn that into politically, administratively viable policies, and then the politicians will have to go out to persuade people to vote for this, vote for that. So we all have to play a role.
Going back to comparing crises, so you talked about the 1920s, 30s, the robber barons, lots of riots on the streets, etc., lots of resistance, and you talk about now, and you say essentially it's this easy access to money which placates the public to some degree.
Right, it's one of the factors, I'm not saying that.
So I wonder if there's a sort of a more, what I call an insidious aspect to this, which is another structural difference, namely the ability for neoliberalism to be able to appropriate, commodify, co-opt pretty much anything. It's epitomated by a Che Guevara t-shirt. You can see how an agent for change like the World Social Forum, for example, was seen as maybe a big beacon of hope for some change, but it essentially ends up as just a bunch of NGOs. Recent inventions or creations like social enterprises, which seem to take this whole idea of trying to do something positive for society, but put it into a framework that has to be financially viable and stick to particular rules, as this overarching agents to placate any real agent for change and to keep capitalism and neoliberalism sort of bubbling along.
As some people call it, the technology of government, it has become far more sophisticated, hasn't it? So, but I mean, this is not new. I mean, in all eras, you had systems of co-optation, of dissident voices, systems of isolating the troublemakers. I mean, could involve violence, but that could involve different means. So I mean, that basically no change comes quietly. As far as it's a big change. So you have to accept that this has always been a problem. But it really depends on how you use it. I mean, all of these new technologies of government. So for example, a lot of people believe that internet and social media has been a very negative thing because it has spread fake news and all sorts of misinformation in the US in the run-up to the presidential election, in Britain in the run-up to Brexit. But I mean, there are examples where social media was used in a very positive way. I mean, when millions of South Koreans took to the street for 10 weekends in a row in the middle of the winter between 2016 and 2017, social media played a great role. I mean, people were messaging each other, even including information like where the toilet is in that area, and that it was a great tool for social mobilization. all these smartphones and so on can become a weapon against repression, because if the riot police is beating up someone, you can actually film it and send it off. Yeah? So actually, what really matters is how people use it, which then means that people need to have the right ideas and right approaches. Yeah? That's why education is important. That's why social campaign is important. Yeah? Because after all technologies, all rules, all organizations, they can be abused, they can be perverted. Ultimately, it's the people. Yeah? So that's why I keep emphasizing the need for having broader conversation with everyone in society, everyone playing a role, because without people wanting the right things, without people having the right approach to things, nothing good is going to come out of this. Yeah?